The streets of Washington, D.C. bustled with life as Admiral James Harper walked along the sidewalk, his polished black shoes clicking steadily against the pavement. The mid-morning sun warmed the city, but for Harper, the day felt cold and heavy. He wore his Navy uniform with pride, the gold trim glinting in the light, and the weight of his medals pressed reassuringly against his chest. It was a symbol of his years of service, sacrifice, and hard-earned respect. Yet, despite the dignity his attire conveyed, Harper couldn't shake the unease settling in his stomach. He scanned the crowds flowing around him, suits rushing to offices, tourists snapping photos of landmarks, street vendors peddling their goods. For most, he was invisible. But to a few, he was not. Harper caught the occasional furtive glance, the kind that lingered just a moment too long before quickly darting away. Some looks held curiosity, others indifference, but a few carried something sharper, something that pierced the armor of his confidence, like a dagger. He kept his shoulders squared and his stride purposeful, but inside, he felt it. That familiar weight of prejudice. It wasn't blatant, but it was there, a quiet, insidious undercurrent. Harper had encountered it before, even as a high-ranking officer. It came in the form of whispered remarks, subtle exclusions, and assumptions made without question. This was different, though. Walking among civilians who didn't know his rank or his story, he felt stripped of the respect his uniform should command. As Harper turned a corner, he noticed a group of children playing on the steps of a church. One little boy stopped mid-laugh to look up at him. His wide brown eyes held pure admiration, the kind Harper hadn't seen in years. The boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. She glanced at Harper and smiled politely before hurrying her son along. For a brief moment, the Admiral's chest swelled with pride. He nodded at the boy, a silent acknowledgement of his innocent awe. Still, the unease remained. Harper replayed a conversation from earlier that week with a junior officer. The young man had confided in him about a troubling experience of discrimination during a routine interaction with local authorities. Harper had listened intently, offering words of encouragement and advice, but now he wondered if he had done enough. If prejudice could touch someone like him, a decorated Navy admiral, what chance did the young officer have? Lost in thought, Harper didn't notice the police cruiser slowing to a crawl beside him until he heard the short burst of a siren. He turned to see a uniformed officer stepping out of the vehicle. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face stern and unreadable as he approached. Harper stopped, his instincts on high alert. "Good morning, sir," the officer said, his tone clipped. "May I see some identification?" Harper blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I beg your pardon." The officer's expression hardened. "Your ID, sir?" "I need to see it." Harper felt his jaw tighten. He straightened his posture, letting his authoritative presence take over. "Officer, I'm Admiral James Harper, United States Navy." He gestured to his uniform, as if it should explain everything. The officer didn't flinch. "I'll still need to see your identification," he said, his voice steady but firm. For a moment, Harper considered refusing. The request was unnecessary and demeaning. But the onlookers gathering around the scene reminded him that this was not just about him. With a measured sigh, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his ID, handing it over. The officer examined it closely, then looked back at Harper. His expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or defiance. "Wait here," the officer said, turning back toward his cruiser. Harper stood still, his hands clasped behind his back. He could feel the weight of the stares from passersby. Whispers began to ripple through the small crowd. The boy from the church steps was among them, holding his mother's hand tightly. His innocent eye had been replaced with confusion and concern. As Harper waited, his mind raced. He thought about the years he had spent serving his country, about the sacrifices he had made and the principles he had fought to uphold. And now here he was, being treated like a common suspect. The officer returned, his demeanor more assertive. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the station," he said. Harper's heart sank, but his face remained impassive. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Suspicious behavior," the officer replied curtly. The unease Harper had felt all morning now boiled into a simmering anger, but he kept it contained. Years of military discipline had taught him how to manage his emotions under pressure. He extended his hands, allowing the officer to place handcuffs on his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, and humiliation washed over him as the whispers turned into gasps. The Admiral glanced back at the boy in the crowd one last time, offering a reassuring smile despite the sting of injustice. Then, with his head held high, he allowed himself to be led away, determined that this moment would not define him, but it would ignite something far greater. The police station was stark and cold, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over Admiral James Harper as he sat in the corner of the waiting area. His uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden under the scrutiny of officers and staff moving through the space. The quiet murmur of voices and the occasional ring of a phone filled the room, but for Harper, everything felt distant, muffled, as if he were watching himself from afar. His hands, still marked by the pressure of the handcuffs, rested lightly on his knees. Though his expression was composed, a storm brewed beneath the surface. Harper had faced adversity before on foreign soil, in the heat of combat, and in the corridors of military command, but this moment felt uniquely painful. To be treated like a criminal, despite a lifetime of honorable service, was a wound to his spirit. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on his breathing. Anger threatened to rise, but Harper knew that giving into it would serve no purpose. His resolve hardened as he replayed the events of the past hour in his mind. The officer's dismissal of his credentials, the cold click of the handcuffs, the stares of passers-by, each detail etched itself into his memory. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a deeper issue. An officer approached, breaking his thoughts. "Admiral Harper," the man said, his tone formal, but lacking warmth. "You'll need to wait here until we sort this out." Harper nodded silently, offering no response. The officer hesitated, as if expecting a reaction, but Harper's calm demeanor left him unsettled. As the officer walked away, Harper's gaze wandered to the front desk. There, a young man in civilian clothes was pleading with a desk sergeant about a minor traffic violation. The sergeant dismissed him with a wave of his hand, his impatience evident. Harper noticed the frustration on the young man's face, the way his shoulders sagged as he realized he wouldn't get anywhere. It was a small moment, but it underscored a larger truth. The system often failed those who needed it most. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. Harper's thoughts drifted to his late father, a man who had taught him the value of patience and principle. When you're met with injustice, his father used to say, "Don't just react. Strategize. Make your response count." Harper had lived by those words, and they steadied him now. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps drew his attention. The officer who had detained him, Officer Derek Mitchell, entered the room, his expression a mix of defensiveness and authority. He stopped a few feet from Harper and crossed his arms. "You're free to go," Mitchell said flatly, his voice devoid of apology. Harper raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, waiting for further explanation. There was a misunderstanding, Mitchell continued, though the words were begrudging. "But next time, maybe don't act so suspicious." Harper stood slowly, his towering presence commanding attention. "Suspicious?" he asked, his voice measured but sharp. "Walking down a public street in my uniform is suspicious?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Just go," he said, avoiding Harper's gaze. Harper didn't move immediately. He wanted to say more, to demand accountability, but he knew this wasn't the time or place. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, and stepped past Mitchell without another word. As Harper exited the station, the crisp winter air hit his face, grounding him. He paused on the steps, taking in the city around him. The world continued as if nothing had happened, but for Harper, everything felt different. A voice called out behind him, "James." Harper turned to see Jonathan Blake, an old friend and senior government official, striding toward him. Blake's usually calm demeanor was replaced with visible anger. "I just heard what happened," he said, gripping Harper's shoulder firmly. "This is unacceptable. You didn't deserve this, not after everything you've done for this country." Harper shook his head slightly. "It's not about me, Jonathan," he replied. "This is bigger than one incident. It's about what this represents." Blake's expression softened, but his resolve was clear. "Let's make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll handle Officer Mitchell, but we need to address the system that allows this to happen." Harper nodded, a glimmer of determination returning to his eyes. "Agreed. But we won't act out of anger. We'll act with purpose." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling between them. Finally, Blake said, "Come on. Let's get out of here. You've got work to do." As they walked away from the station, Harper's mind was already turning over the possibilities. He would not let this incident fade into the background. It was a call to action, and he intended to answer it with the same dedication he had shown throughout his career. The quiet hum of Admiral James Harper's office was a stark contrast to the chaotic scenes of the past day. Seated at his desk, Harper stared at the array of papers in front of him. Reports, notes, and reminders formed a cluttered map of thoughts, each thread leading back to the same central point: systemic prejudice. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, deliberate breath. His encounter with Officer Derek Mitchell at the station was no longer just a memory. It had become a catalyst. It wasn't about the personal insult or even the humiliation. It was about the undeniable reality that his experience wasn't unique. Harper had spent his career protecting and defending the ideals of justice and equality, but now those very principles felt under siege. The sound of his phone vibrating broke the silence. Harper glanced at the screen. Jonathan Blake. He picked up the call. "Jonathan," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "James," Blake began, his tone tinged with urgency. "I've made some calls. Officer Mitchell will face an inquiry, but that's just the beginning. We need to talk strategy." Harper nodded, though Blake couldn't see it. "I've been thinking the same. This is bigger than him. It's about accountability, and not just for individuals, but for the systems that enable this behavior." There was a pause on the line. Blake sighed. "You're right. Let's meet tomorrow. We'll bring in a few trusted voices and start laying the groundwork for action." As Harper hung up, a sense of purpose began to take shape. He pulled a notepad toward him and began writing, his pen moving swiftly across the page. He jotted down names of allies, former colleagues, community leaders, and advocates he could trust. These were people who understood the stakes, who could help him turn this personal injustice into a collective mission. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Harper looked up to see Lieutenant Sarah Moore, his trusted aide, standing in the doorway. Her presence was a reminder of the camaraderie and loyalty that had sustained him through decades of service. "Admiral," she said softly, stepping into the room. "I heard about what happened. Are you all right?" Harper offered a faint smile. "I've been through worse, Sarah. But thank you." Moore hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Sir, what they did to you was wrong. But I know you'll turn this into something meaningful." Her words struck a chord. Harper set his pen down and met her gaze. "That's the plan, Lieutenant. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to go through this." Moore nodded, a flicker of pride in her expression. "If there's anything I can do, just say the word." "You'll be hearing from me soon," Harper assured her. As she left, Harper's thoughts turned to the broader implications of his experience. He reflected on the young officer who had confided in him about facing discrimination, on the countless stories he had heard from others over the years. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry, one that revealed the deep and tangled roots of bias within the very systems meant to serve and protect. Harper's mind drifted to his father once more. He could almost hear the old man's voice, firm yet encouraging. "You have a responsibility, James. Not just to yourself, but to those who come after you." The Admiral picked up his pen again, the weight of his resolve driving each stroke. He drafted an outline for the meeting with Blake and their allies. The goal wasn't just to seek justice for himself. It was to create a roadmap for change. They would push for comprehensive training programs, independent oversight committees, and community engagement initiatives. Harper envisioned a future where stories like his would be the exception, not the norm. As the hours passed, Harper lost himself in the work. The anger and humiliation he had felt earlier were now channeled into a determined focus. By the time he set his pen down again, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shades of amber and gold. Harper stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city. The lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled like distant stars, a reminder of the countless lives moving through the city, each with their own struggles and triumphs. He thought of the boy he had seen outside the church, his wide eyes filled with admiration. Harper felt a pang of responsibility, if not for himself, then for children like that boy, who deserved a world where dignity and respect were the rule, not the exception. Harper's phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from Blake. "Meeting confirmed for a.m. tomorrow. Let's make this count." The Admiral replied simply, "We will." As he closed his office for the night, Harper felt a flicker of hope amid the weight of the task ahead. Change wouldn't come easily, but he knew it was possible. And for the first time since his arrest, he felt something new, determination tempered with a quiet sense of purpose. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the conference room where Admiral James Harper and Jonathan Blake sat. The air was thick with anticipation as they reviewed the list of attendees for their first strategy meeting. The goal was clear: to unite a diverse group of voices and craft a path toward meaningful reform. Harper tapped his pen against the edge of the table, his mind racing with thoughts. Each name on the list represented a potential ally, someone with influence or expertise to help tackle the systemic issues they aimed to address. Yet, he couldn't ignore the weight of the task ahead. Would they listen? Would they care enough to act? Jonathan broke the silence. "You know, James," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't going to be easy. Some of these people have their own agendas. Getting them to agree on anything will be a challenge." Harper nodded. "I'm not looking for agreement, Jonathan. I'm looking for commitment. They don't have to see eye to eye on everything, but they need to believe in the importance of the mission. The door opened, and Lieutenant Sarah Moore entered, carrying a stack of folders. "Admiral, Mr. Blake," she said, her tone professional but warm. "The attendees are arriving. Everything's set." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Harper said with a faint smile. As the room filled, Harper scanned the faces around the table. Among them were community leaders, activists, former military colleagues, and even a retired police chief who had been outspoken about reforming law enforcement practices. Each person brought a unique perspective, and Harper felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. When everyone was seated, Harper stood, his tall frame commanding attention. He began with a simple but powerful statement. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries because the issue we're addressing doesn't afford us the luxury of time. What happened to me last week was unjust, but it's not unique. It's a reflection of a deeper problem that affects countless others who don't have the platform or resources I have. And that's why we're here to address the systems that allow prejudice to persist." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Harper could see nods of agreement from some and cautious expressions from others. He continued, sharing his vision for actionable reforms, from improved training for law enforcement to creating independent oversight committees. As he spoke, Harper's voice grew firmer, his passion shining through. This isn't about revenge or assigning blame to individuals. It's about accountability and building trust between those who serve and the communities they protect. It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. When Harper finished, there was a brief silence before the retired police chief, a stout man with silver hair named Robert Hayes, spoke up. "Admiral, I respect your service and your determination," Hayes said, his deep voice resonating. "But you're asking for a cultural shift, and that's not something that happens overnight. You'll face resistance both from within the system and from those who don't want to see change." Harper nodded, his expression unwavering. "I understand that, Chief Hayes. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't happen at all unless we start. Resistance is inevitable, but so is progress if we're persistent." Another voice chimed in, this time from Linda Chavez, a community activist known for her work with underserved neighborhoods. "What you're proposing is ambitious, Admiral, but it's also necessary. People in my community have been demanding these changes for years, and we've seen little movement. If your voice can amplify ours, then I'm in." The room began to buzz with conversation, each person contributing their insights and concerns. Harper listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. He knew this was only the beginning, but the energy in the room was a spark one he hoped would ignite a larger flame. At one point, Jonathan leaned over and whispered, "You're doing well, James." "They're engaged." Harper gave a slight nod, though he knew there was still much work to be done. As the meeting wrapped up, Harper addressed the group once more. "I want to thank each of you for your honesty and your commitment. This isn't a one-time conversation. It's the start of a movement, and I need all of you to be part of it. Together, we can create something that outlasts us, a system that serves everyone with fairness and integrity." The attendees began to file out, some stopping to shake Harper's hand or exchange contact information. Sarah Moore approached him, her expression filled with quiet pride. "You handled that beautifully, Admiral," she said. "I think you've got their attention." Harper glanced around the emptying room, his resolve solidifying. "Getting their attention was the first step, Sarah. Now comes the hard part, turning words into action. The buzz of enthusiasm from the initial meeting had barely settled when Admiral James Harper and his core group of allies encountered their first major obstacle. In the days following the gathering, Harper and Jonathan Blake worked tirelessly to draft a proposal for systemic reform. The plan was comprehensive. It included measures for mandatory training on implicit bias, independent oversight committees, and increased community involvement in law enforcement policy making. But as they prepared to present their ideas to a broader audience, resistance began to surface. Harper sat in his office, reading through a stack of letters and emails that Sarah Moore had carefully sorted for him. Some messages were supportive, thanking him for taking a stand and offering words of encouragement. Others, however, were harsher, dismissive at best, openly hostile at worst. "This one's tough," Sarah said, handing him a letter from a city council member. The letter, though professionally worded, made it clear that the council member believed Harper's proposals were impractical and an overreach. Harper read the letter silently, his jaw tightening as he finished. "It's not unexpected," he said finally, setting the letter down. "Change always comes with resistance." Jonathan entered the room, his face serious but determined. "James, I just got off the phone with Chief Hayes. He's been fielding calls from some of his old colleagues' officers who think this whole initiative is an attack on law enforcement." Harper frowned. "It's not an attack. It's an opportunity to improve." "Why can't they see that?" Jonathan sighed. "Because change feels like criticism to people who are comfortable with the status quo. They don't want to admit the system is flawed because it means admitting they've been part of the problem." Harper stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The city stretched out before him, bustling with life, yet each person moving through it was affected in some way by the systems he was trying to change. He thought about the young boy he had seen outside the church that day. That boy deserved to grow up in a world where fairness and justice weren't just ideals but realities. "I don't care how much resistance we face," Harper said, his voice low but resolute. "We're not backing down. This isn't about comfort, it's about doing what's right." The next day, Harper and his team presented their proposal to a coalition of community leaders, city officials, and law enforcement representatives. The room was filled with tension as they outlined their vision for reform. Harper spoke with the same quiet authority he had honed over decades of military service, but he could feel the skepticism in the air. As he finished, a hand shot up from the back of the room. It belonged to an officer named Daniel Wright, a seasoned member of the force with a reputation for being outspoken. "With all due respect, Admiral," Wright began, his tone sharp, "you're asking us to overhaul a system that's been in place for decades. You talk about bias and accountability, but have you considered how these changes will affect the men and women who put their lives on the line every day?" Harper met Wright's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Officer Wright, I respect the sacrifices you and your colleagues make. But if the system we rely on to protect us is also harming the very people it's meant to serve, isn't it our duty to fix it? This isn't about punishing officers, it's about ensuring fairness for everyone." Wright hesitated, his brows furrowing. The room was silent, all eyes on Harper and the officer. Linda Chavez, the community activist, spoke up next. "Officer Wright, with all due respect, the people in my neighborhood don't feel protected. They feel targeted. We're not asking for perfection. We're asking for progress." The tension in the room eased slightly as other voices joined the conversation, some echoing Wright's concerns, others supporting Harper's vision. The dialogue was intense but constructive, a reminder that change, while difficult, often begins with uncomfortable conversations. After the meeting, Harper sat alone in the now empty room, his thoughts heavy. Sarah entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "You did well," she said, sitting across from him. Harper shook his head. "I don't know, Sarah. The resistance is stronger than I anticipated. I'm not sure if they're ready or willing to change." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes steady. "They don't have to be ready, sir. They just have to see that you're not giving up. Change isn't about immediate results, it's about persistence. And if anyone can lead this fight, it's you." Her words resonated deeply, reminding Harper of his father's wisdom. When the path gets difficult, don't look for an easier one. Strength comes from walking forward, even when every step feels impossible. Harper straightened, a renewed determination in his eyes. "You're right, Sarah. This isn't about winning over everyone overnight. It's about planting the seeds for something bigger. And I won't stop until those seeds take root." The auditorium was packed, with a sea of faces reflecting every shade of emotion: hope, skepticism, and curiosity. Admiral James Harper stood behind the podium, the soft hum of whispered conversations filling the air as he prepared to speak. It had been weeks since the fateful incident with Officer Derek Mitchell, weeks of relentless meetings, difficult conversations, and tireless planning. Now, Harper was ready to bring his message to the public, to spark a movement that could no longer be ignored. Jonathan Blake stood to the side of the stage, giving Harper a nod of encouragement. Sarah Moore sat in the front row, her notepad balanced on her knee, ready to capture every word. Harper gripped the edges of the podium, scanning the crowd. He saw community leaders, police officers, activists, and everyday citizens. Some were expressions of support, others of doubt. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then he began to speak. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady but resonant. "I stand before you tonight not as a victim, but as a man determined to turn an unjust experience into an opportunity for change." The room fell silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. Harper's words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. "A few weeks ago, I was stopped on a public street, handcuffed and detained despite wearing the uniform of a United States Navy admiral. I was treated not as a man who has dedicated his life to serving this country, but as someone whose character was judged before a single question was asked. That moment was humiliating, but it was also enlightening." Harper paused, his eyes sweeping the audience. He saw the impact of his words in their faces, the small shifts in posture, the furrowed brows, the nods of understanding. "Because that moment," he continued, "wasn't about me. It was about something far greater. It was a reflection of a system that too often judges individuals by their appearance rather than their actions. A system that undermines the trust between those who serve and those they are meant to protect. And it's a system that we must change together." The audience remained transfixed as Harper recounted his journey since the incident. He spoke of the allies he had gathered, the resistance they had faced, and the small victories they had won. But he also acknowledged the challenges ahead. "This isn't an easy fight," Harper admitted, his voice tinged with both determination and vulnerability. "Change is never easy. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question the systems we've always accepted, and to push forward even when the path feels impossible. But I believe in us, I believe in the power of this community, this country, to rise above fear and prejudice and create something better." In the front row, Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen Harper's struggles up close, the toll this fight had taken on him. But here he was, standing tall, his voice unwavering, his resolve stronger than ever. A hand shot up in the audience. Harper gestured toward the woman, a middle-aged teacher with kind eyes and a worn notebook clutched to her chest. "Admiral Harper," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I teach in a school where many of my students are afraid of the police. They see them not as protectors, but as threats. How do we rebuild that trust? How do we make them feel safe?" Harper's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his tone turning compassionate. "That's a powerful question," he said. "And the answer isn't simple. It starts with accountability, not just for individual officers, but for the system as a whole. It means creating policies that prioritize fairness and transparency. But most importantly, it means listening to your students, to their families, to the voices that have been ignored for too long. Trust isn't built through words alone. It's built through consistent action." The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy that surged through Harper and strengthened his resolve. After the speech, as the crowd began to disperse, Harper was approached by a young police officer. The man looked nervous, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Admiral Harper," the officer said, his voice tentative. "I wanted to say thank you. What you're doing, it matters. I joined the force because I wanted to help people, but I see the flaws in the system too. I want to be part of the solution." Harper extended his hand, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, officer. It's people like you who give me hope. This fight isn't just about pointing out what's wrong, it's about building something better. Together." As Harper left the auditorium that night, flanked by Jonathan and Sarah, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but the voices he had heard tonight reminded him why the fight was worth it. The ripple effect of Admiral James Harper's public speech was undeniable. Over the following days, messages of support poured in from across the city and beyond. Teachers, community leaders, and even a few law enforcement officers voiced their agreement with his call for reform. Harper's words had struck a chord, igniting hope in those who had long felt unheard. But with the wave of support came a growing undercurrent of resistance, louder, more pointed, and deeply entrenched. Harper sat in a small cafe across from Jonathan Blake, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the low murmur of conversations around them. The weight of the opposition was evident in Blake's expression as he scrolled through his phone, reading aloud the latest headlines. Admiral Harper's reforms, a threat to law enforcement. Blake read, his tone edged with frustration. "And here's another. Is this about justice or politics? They're twisting your message, James." Harper sipped his coffee, his gaze steady but contemplative. "It's not unexpected," he said. "When people feel their way of life is threatened, they lash out. This isn't just about policy, it's about fear. Fear of change, fear of losing control." Blake set his phone down, leaning forward. "The opposition isn't just coming from fringe groups. Some city officials are starting to backpedal on their support. They're saying your proposals are too ambitious, that we're moving too fast." Harper's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Too fast," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Tell that to the families who've waited generations for fairness and accountability. Tell that to the young officer who feels trapped in a system that doesn't reflect the values he signed up to protect. Change might feel fast to them, but for too many, it's already overdue." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Linda Chavez, the passionate community activist who had become one of Harper's most vocal allies. She slid into the booth beside Blake, her eyes flashing with determination. "Admiral," she began, "we need to talk strategy. The opposition is organizing rallies, and they're pulling in big names to discredit our efforts. We can't just react to them, we need to control the narrative." Harper nodded, appreciating her urgency. "Agreed." "What's the plan?" Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice. "We need more stories. personal ones. People whose lives have been impacted by systemic bias, both civilians and officers. If we can humanize this issue, make it about real experiences, we'll cut through the noise. People connect with stories, not statistics. Harper's mind flashed back to the young boy he had seen outside the church, the way his eye had turned to confusion as Harper was led away in handcuffs. "You're right," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Stories have power. They remind us what's at stake." Later that evening, Harper and his team gathered at his home, the living room transformed into an impromptu war room. Sarah Moore stood by a whiteboard, jotting down key points as the group brainstormed. Jonathan paced the room, bouncing ideas off Linda, while Harper listened, his presence a calming anchor amid the energy. "I've reached out to a few people willing to share their stories," Sarah said, tapping her marker against the board. A single mother who faced discrimination during a routine traffic stop, an officer who left the force because he couldn't reconcile his values with the system, and a high school student who's organizing a community dialogue on policing. Harper nodded. "Good. These voices need to be amplified. This isn't about me, it's about them, about all of us." As the night wore on, the group refined their plans. They would host a public forum, inviting people from all walks of life to share their experiences and visions for change. It would be a space for dialogue, for connection, and for collective action. But even as momentum built, the resistance grew fiercer. Harper received anonymous letters accusing him of betraying his country, of undermining law enforcement. Online forums buzzed with vitriol, painting him as a radical out to dismantle the very fabric of society. One evening, as Harper sifted through a particularly harsh stack of messages, Sarah found him in his study. She placed a steaming mug of tea on his desk, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay, Admiral?" she asked gently. Harper looked up, offering a faint smile. "I've faced worse, Sarah. But it's different. The fight isn't just external, it's internal. Convincing people to see what they don't want to see, to believe in something better, it's harder than I imagined." Sarah sat down across from him, her voice soft but resolute. "You've inspired so many, sir. Don't let the loudest voices drown out the ones who believe in you. You're not alone in this." Her words struck a chord, and Harper felt a renewed sense of purpose. He thought about his father's lessons, about the principles that had guided his life. This was a battle worth fighting, not for accolades, but for a future built on justice and integrity. The next day, Harper stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd that had gathered for the first of many public forums. His voice rang out over the noise of the city, clear and unwavering. "This isn't about division," he said. "It's about unity. It's about recognizing that our systems aren't perfect and having the courage to make them better. I know the road ahead is long, and I know we'll face challenges. But I also know this: change is possible. And together, we can achieve it." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a reminder that even amid resistance, there was hope. The momentum behind Admiral James Harper's movement was undeniable. As weeks turned into months, his message began to resonate with people from all walks of life. Community forums grew larger, and each event brought new voices to the forefront, stories of struggle, resilience, and a shared hope for change. Harper felt the tide shifting, but he also knew that every step forward brought new challenges. One sunny afternoon, Harper found himself at a community center in a bustling part of the city. The space was alive with energy as volunteers prepared for the evening's forum. Children darted between tables, their laughter ringing out as they helped set up chairs, while adults worked tirelessly to arrange refreshments and organize speakers. In the midst of the activity, Harper was approached by a young woman in her early 20s. Her name was Mia Thompson, a college student who had recently organized a protest at her university. She had bright, determined eyes that belied the exhaustion etched into her face. "Admiral Harper," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your words, they've inspired so many of us. We've been fighting for change on campus for years, but it always felt like no one was listening. Now, it feels like we're part of something bigger." Harper smiled warmly. "Mia, it's people like you who inspire me. Your courage, your dedication, it's what gives this movement life. Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us working together." As the evening's forum began, Harper took his place at the front of the room. The audience was diverse students, parents, police officers, business owners, all united by a shared desire to build a better future. Harper listened intently as speaker after speaker shared their experiences, each story painting a vivid picture of the systemic issues they faced. One speaker was Officer Aaron Blake, a young African-American police officer who had recently joined the movement. He spoke with a mixture of pride and vulnerability, describing the challenges of being caught between two worlds. "I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference," Aaron said, his voice resonating through the room. "But too often, I've seen the system fail the people it's meant to protect. That's why I'm here, not to tear it down, but to help rebuild it into something we can all trust." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Harper felt a swell of pride as he watched Aaron step down, his words striking a chord with everyone present. But as the movement grew, so did the opposition. Powerful figures who felt threatened by Harper's vision began to push back more forcefully. A smear campaign emerged, painting him as a radical intent on dismantling law enforcement. Misleading headlines and sound bites twisted his words, creating doubt among those who had once supported him. One evening, as Harper reviewed the latest round of attacks, Jonathan Blake entered his office, his expression grave. "James," Jonathan said, setting a thick folder on the desk. "We've got a problem. The mayor is being pressured to pull her support for the reforms. If she caves, we could lose critical funding for the community programs we're building." Harper frowned, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Who's pressuring her?" "Some influential donors," Jonathan replied. "People with deep pockets and a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. They're framing this as a threat to public safety." Harper's gaze hardened. "Public safety? How safe are we when entire communities feel abandoned or targeted by the system that's supposed to protect them?" "They're not protecting public safety, they're protecting their power," Jonathan nodded. "I know, but we need to act fast. If we lose the mayor's support, it could set us back months, even years." Harper leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about the people who had shared their stories, the young boy outside the church, Mia's determination, and Aaron's vulnerability. They had placed their trust in him, and he wasn't about to let them down. The next day, Harper requested a private meeting with the mayor. The two sat across from each other in a modest conference room, the weight of their conversation pressing down on the air around them. "Admiral Harper," the mayor began, her tone measured but cautious. "I respect what you're trying to do, but the political pressure I'm facing is immense. If I continue to back your reforms, I risk losing the support of key donors, and without their funding, my hands are tied." Harper leaned forward, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "Madam Mayor, I understand the challenges you're facing. But this isn't just about politics, it's about people. The communities you are elected to serve are crying out for change. If we let fear dictate our actions, we'll only perpetuate the very problems we're trying to solve. The mayor studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with resolve. "You make a compelling case, Admiral. I'll stand by your reforms, but only if we can show the public that this is about building a stronger, safer community for everyone." Harper nodded. "That's exactly what we're doing. And I'll work with you to make that message clear." As Harper left the meeting, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but the support of the mayor was a critical victory. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew that every step forward brought them closer to a future where justice and fairness were not just ideals, but realities. The sound of clicking keyboards and ringing phones filled the temporary headquarters of Admiral James Harper's movement. The once small group of allies had grown into a full-fledged team, bustling with energy and purpose. Public opinion had started to shift. News outlets were beginning to focus on the personal stories that had emerged from Harper's formed stories of courage, resilience, and a shared longing for justice. Harper sat at a long table in the center of the room, reviewing a schedule of upcoming events. His focus was sharp, but he carried the weight of the journey on his shoulders. Jonathan Blake entered, holding a newspaper with a bold headline that read, "Harper's Reforms. A path to unity or division. We're getting traction, James," Jonathan said, setting the paper down. "But the opposition isn't letting up. They're doubling down on the idea that your reforms will weaken law enforcement." Harper glanced at the headline, then leaned back in his chair. "That narrative is built on fear," he said. "We need to counter it with truth. If we let fear control the conversation, we'll lose sight of what's possible." The tension in the room was broken by the arrival of Mia Thompson and Officer Aaron Blake, two of the movement's most vocal supporters. Mia carried a folder stuffed with handwritten letters from community members, while Aaron held a tablet displaying a new campaign video they had created. "Admiral," Mia said, her voice bright but tinged with urgency, "we've been collecting testimonials from people all over the city. Their stories are powerful. These are the voices that will cut through the noise." Aaron nodded. "We also put together a video highlighting the success of the community programs we've already started. It's short, but it shows real progress." Harper took the tablet and watched the video. It showed scenes from community dialogues, youth mentorship programs, and neighborhood events that had fostered trust and understanding. The final clip featured a single mother tearfully thanking the team for helping her son find a safe space to grow. Harper's chest tightened as he felt the depth of their impact. "This is excellent," Harper said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's exactly what we need to remind people that this movement is about solutions, not division." As the team worked late into the night, Harper received a call from Linda Chavez. Her tone was serious, almost urgent. "Admiral," Linda began, "I just heard from one of our contacts. The opposition is planning a rally tomorrow. Big names, big money, and a lot of media attention. They're framing it as a pushback against your reforms, calling it a defense of law and order." Harper's jaw tightened. "We can't let them control the narrative," he said. "We need to respond, but not with anger. We respond with clarity and purpose." The next morning, Harper and his team organized a press conference on the steps of City Hall. The crowd was smaller than the opposition's rally, but filled with passionate supporters. Harper stood before the microphones, his presence commanding but his tone calm and deliberate. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "This movement is not against law enforcement. It's for accountability, fairness, and trust. We are not here to weaken our systems. We are here to strengthen them. Real strength comes from integrity, and real safety comes from justice." He paused, letting his words sink in. To those who say change is dangerous, I ask, what's more dangerous, acknowledging our flaws and working to fix them, or ignoring them and letting the cracks grow deeper? This is not about division. It's about unity. It's about building a future where every person, no matter their background, feels protected and valued. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing down the street. Cameras flashed, and reporters leaned forward, eager to capture every word. Harper's message resonated, not just because of its content, but because of the conviction with which it was delivered. As Harper stepped away from the podium, he was approached by a young reporter who had been covering the movement since its inception. "Admiral Harper," she said, her voice filled with genuine curiosity, "how do you stay so composed in the face of such intense opposition?" Harper paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because this isn't about me," he said. "It's about the people who've placed their trust in this movement. When I think about them, about the stories I've heard and the lives we're fighting for, it gives me strength. And it reminds me that the fight is worth it, no matter how hard it gets." Later that evening, Harper returned to the headquarters, where the team was reviewing footage from the day's events. Sarah Moore approached him with a smile that hinted at exhaustion, but also pride. "You were incredible today, sir," she said. "You turned the tide." Harper shook his head slightly. "The tide isn't turned yet, Sarah. But we're closer. Every voice we amplify, every bridge we build, it brings us closer to the change we're fighting for." The room was alive with energy. Supporters, allies, and media filled the grand hall, their voices creating a soft hum of anticipation. Admiral James Harper stood backstage, his hands clasped in front of him, his uniform pressed and polished. This was the culmination of months of tireless effort, a moment that felt both exhilarating and sobering. Jonathan Blake stood beside him, his expression a mixture of pride and nervous energy. "James, this is it," he said, his voice steady. "Your message has reached farther than any of us imagined. Whatever happens after tonight, know that you've already changed lives." Harper nodded, his face calm but his heart pounding. "It's not about me, Jonathan. It's about the people who've trusted us to fight for them. This isn't an ending, it's a beginning." The lights dimmed, and the crowd fell silent as Harper stepped onto the stage. A single spotlight illuminated him as he approached the podium. He paused for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him. Each one represented a story, a hope, a piece of the larger movement. "Good evening," he began, his voice resonant yet gentle. "Tonight, we stand at a crossroads, a moment where the choices we make will shape not just our future, but the futures of generations to come." The room was still, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a blanket. "When this journey began," Harper continued, "it was sparked by a moment of injustice. A moment that could have been forgotten, dismissed as just another unfortunate incident. But we refused to let it be forgotten. We refused to accept that injustice was simply the way things are." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "We've faced resistance. We've been called radicals, dreamers, even fools. But the truth is, we are none of those things. We are believers in the idea that fairness, accountability, and dignity are not privileges, they are rights. And we are here to ensure those rights are upheld for every single person." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of emotion that swept through the hall. Harper let it wash over him, then raised a hand to quiet the room. "This movement has never been about one person," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's about the mother who wants her child to grow up without fear. It's about the officer who wants to serve with integrity, but feels betrayed by a broken system. It's about the student who dares to dream of a world where justice is not just an ideal but a reality." Harper's voice softened, and he leaned slightly forward, his tone more intimate. "I've heard your stories. I've seen your courage, and I am humbled by the trust you've placed in this movement. But the truth is, I can't do this alone. None of us can. Real change doesn't come from one person, it comes from all of us, united in purpose and unwavering in our determination." The audience was enraptured, their focus entirely on Harper. He took a deep breath, his next words carrying a weight that seemed to echo beyond the room. "There will be more obstacles," he said. "There will be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of this fight feels too heavy. But in those moments, remember this: change is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It is hard, messy, and often slow. But it is worth it. Because every step we take brings us closer to a world that reflects the best of who we are." Tears glistened in the eyes of many in the crowd, their emotions laid bare. Harper's voice grew stronger, his resolve shining through. "As we leave this room tonight, I ask one thing of you. Carry this message forward. Speak out. Stand up. Refuse to accept the status quo when it fails to honor our shared humanity. Each of you has the power to be a catalyst for change, to make a difference in your own communities. And together, we can create a ripple effect that will reach far beyond what we can see." The crowd rose to their feet, the applause thunderous. Harper stood silently for a moment, taking in the magnitude of the moment. When the applause subsided, he concluded, his voice soft but filled with hope. "This movement is not about me. It's about us. And as long as we stand together, as long as we keep moving forward, there is nothing we cannot achieve." As Harper stepped off the stage, he was greeted by his team, their faces alight with pride and determination. Mia Thompson hugged him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "Admiral, you've given us more than hope, you've given us a path." Aaron Blake clapped him on the shoulder, his own voice thick. "We've got your back, sir. All the way." Harper smiled, his heart full. The fight wasn't over, but this moment was a victory, a testament to what could be accomplished when people came together with a shared purpose. As he looked out at the crowd one last time, Harper felt a deep sense of peace. He had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead, but he also knew this: the seeds of change had been planted, and they would grow.